Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the human being as an automaton. My guest is my good friend James Tunney. He is the author of The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, The Mystery of the Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism, Empire of Scientism, Tech Bondage, Human Entrance to Transhumanism, and most recently, Plantation of the Automatons. James lives in Gothenburg, Sweden, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. It's a real pleasure to be together with you once again. It's been quite a while.
It's great to hook up with you again, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
The issue today is the human being as an automaton, and it's sort of reminiscent of all of the work of the great philosopher and existentialist and occultist Colin Wilson, who often suggested that humans tend to go into a sort of a robotic state of mind, that we really have to work at waking up and being fully conscious.
Yes, in relation to the work that you have done over the years, there's a theme which comes up with a lot of thinkers on spirituality, is that we live in an unawakened state, or we're in a sleepwalking state, or as Colin Wilson talked about, there's an inner robot that takes over. And this is the same. This has been a preoccupation for many spiritual teachers, as you know. Gurdjieff and Osho and them focus on this idea of a kind of robotic approach to life, where we fail to appreciate our consciousness. And Colin Wilson certainly developed that theme, but it was a theme that goes back to ancient Greece, ancient Egypt. It's a recurrent theme. It relates to the idea of the human as a puppet of the gods. And there's another doctrine which is very interesting, the tread doctrine, the Sutraman, and the idea that we're linked with the heavens, with treads, with the gods by treads. We can see this in Egyptian art. Ananda Coomarasamy has written about this. It's very important in Indian philosophy. So on the spiritual side, there's also an idea associated with us being puppets in some way, or controlled, or linked in a positive and a negative sense to other forces. So when Colin Wilson is focusing on the idea, he's talking about the way, in a psychological sense, the way we do things automatically, the way he cites the example of driving a car, or doing things that our body knows how, our mind knows how to do so. So that's one aspect of us being automatons, the psychological aspect. We could also as well add in a context of prosthesis, where we take drugs, and that we have the studies about zombies. I met Wade Davis, who studied the phenomenon of zombies in Haiti, and the idea, and he came up with the idea of the use of a neurotoxin might be associated with certain types of zombieism. So we have a similar thing. It's a similar way that we can reduce ourselves to automatic behavior. And now we have to add in extra ideas that with transhumanism we can have implants which can, by prosthesis again, make us into some kind of automatons. And in addition to that, just to contextualize what we'll discuss about, there's also an idea from mathematics, from Alan Turing, that he starts off with a mathematical idea of an automaton, which was the basis of a lot of development of computing and computing science and artificial intelligence, a kind of mathematical model of a machine. You wrote a paper in 1936. So there's a series of ideas of automatons, but in the spiritual context, that's correct, that Colin Wilson and those focused on that robotic element in us. And it can also manifest itself, for example, in religious practice, where we do things robotically as opposed to being involved in the process in a deeper sense.
I'm under the impression that there's an extent to which this robotic behavior is very healthy. I'm thinking now of athletics. If you're performing an athletic skill, you want to have it so second nature you don't even think about it. It's very robotic. But then, if you're lucky, you go into a zone where you have the robotic ability, but then you transcend that, and that's what great athletes seem to be able to achieve.
That's right. And Michael Murphy has talked about that as sports, and you have talked to him about that issue. And I'm also reminded of your mentor, Arthur M. Young, who talks about the idea that with any system, there's always direction, as he said, at a 90-degree angle to it. There's always the higher order. So if you're a musician or a sports person, what you're doing is training yourself to be automatic. If you're a tennis player, you're becoming an automaton in a positive sense. What you're doing is honing your skills to act in a way that anticipates a range of eventualities. So certainly when the person has mastered those skills, they've mastered the automaticity relevant to the particular task they want, they have the freedom then above that to transcend that. And some sports people have kind of spiritual and mystical experiences associated with that transcendence. So certainly there's a good part. And if I go out for a walk around the lake, there's a large part of that is automatic. So what the body and mind does is delegate tasks, and as it learns the tasks, we can leave it to that automatic behavior. But there's a danger. There's a danger that we go beyond that and apply this automaticity in inappropriate context. So automaticity is at one end of the scale, and autonomy is at the other end of the scale. And in between, there's a question of activation and aims, the purposes to which we apply that automaticity. So yes, sports people, musicians, people that are engaged in high-skilled jobs, occupations, surgeons, they use a degree of automaticity to perform the functions that are necessary for their occupation.
It would strike me that perhaps the most negative example I can think of automaticity have to do with war. If a government wishes to go to war, the citizens often just go along because we're accustomed to doing what the government tells us is right and proper. People don't often question authority, particularly government authority, but there are many other kinds of authority that we are, I would say, programmed to go along with what authorities tell us. And often the authorities are beneficent, and it's to our advantage to take advantage of the wisdom that authorities have. But many times it's really better to question authority.
Well, that's exactly right. And there's another level. So when we're talking about this debate, it's wider for me than the focus that Colin Wilson had, and totally legitimate. But to add to that is elements that I've noticed in particular from a legal background. When we talk about the corporation, we have to understand that the corporation begins to act like an automaton. It's a separate legal personality, and it has particular aims, and it can do things that individuals can't do on an individual level. So if you look at the expansion of the British Empire and the European empires, for example, it was because of the legal vehicles they used. That was a success and an advantage they had over countries in the Far East, for example. So this automized, this separate legal personality begins to act as a particular automatic force, and it can achieve things that can't be achieved on an individual level. And that the development in Britain of the trust, for example, that form of legal cooperation, was revolutionary in relation to the success of, if you want to call it success of the British Empire around the world. So if we think of Hobbes and that and the Leviathan, there's the idea as well that the state is a separate force. And these forces can become monstrous in a way. So if we think even of, say, the Central Intelligence Agency, it's central. Intelligence is a key factor, and the link between state collection of intelligence information and intelligence is a very close one. And agency is important because, as you said, with these agencies, we give up our own agency. We say, okay, in this area, we're not going to get involved in the process, and some other agency decides for us. But there's still a responsibility in relation to these forces. So with the war machine, we have an entire military-industrial complex, and then armies in whatever country and whatever time, they're run as a machine. So when you're coming into the army, you're becoming a component, and this is very, very clear in the recent programs from various military in the Western world and elsewhere, where they're explaining that as the automatic battlefield is coming into being, that the human is merely a component in the overall system. And when we look as well at cybernetics, we see that the great advances in cybernetics were really developed for a war context. And Norbert Wiener, he began looking at how to increase precision in relation to automatic gunfire for aircraft. And there's always a military context. So that machine, that automaton, incorporates the individual. And yes, we lose moral responsibility. So in all these questions, in all these cases, there's a question about to what extent do we relinquish spiritual, in particular, which is a concern for me, and moral responsibility to a machine and distance ourselves through that relinquishment. So you're absolutely right on that.
It would seem, in some sense, the antidote to automaticity in the human being comes from our depths, from, for example, dreams, from fantasies, from the inner life, which no matter how intense the acculturation process is, no matter how much we get squeezed into becoming a cog in the great societal machine, there's always going to be at least some tiny semblance of an inner life, I would think.
Well, yes, and that's the hope, and the reason why your work is important in relation to parapsychology and the study of things which are not commonly accepted shows the importance of these interventions. A lot of access to the spirit world, a lot of mystical experiences come in the form of an intervention. They come in as an intervention into a loop, if you like, that we have got into, because we learn, and this is a key idea in relation to cybernetics, the idea of the loop, the idea of the repetition. And we come into loops of thinking, loops of behavior, and often spirituality and mysticism comes from outside, or seems to come from outside, to intervene in the process. Now, you might say it comes from the right brain to the left brain. There is a clear left brain, right brain context and the bicamerality issues that Ian McGilchrist talks about. So it could be this inner inspiration, if you like, but there's always a sense that it comes from outside, and this is there in the UFO experiences as well. But the problem is that whereas that possibility is always there, that we are on the cusp of a technological advance associated with network transhumanism, which threatens to be able to intervene in us using nanotechnology, broadcasting possibilities, microtransistors, to be able to condition the very inner being of humans. And there was a executive order on September the 12th in the United States, which talks about a new program, a government program, to support industry and bioengineering, which will interfere directly in the circuitry of the human cell, so that governance can be like a computer, so that the person can be treated as a computer. I mean, that's a kind of remarkable statement about where we're going. And the fear is that with the advances in technology, that the possibilities, that richness, that inner possibility can now be interfered with. And it could be interfered with by preventing things happening. So there's a reflexive element of automaticity. As we interact more and more with machines, that we are conditioned by our interaction with them to be made more automatic, to think in a particular way. And now with children, as they're hooked on machines from the time they're born with Generation Alpha, this is part of their nervous system, as Marshall McLuhan anticipated. So it gets more difficult to develop those possibilities, to recognize them, and especially if we're living in what I describe as an empire of scientism, where these things are not fully accepted or fully understood. So there's a great danger that great source of inspiration, of consciousness, of change in society, which always comes from a mystical perspective, can be interfered with and impaired because of a very dominant left brain tendency to try and crystallize consciousness. So I see a lot of the technological developments as similar to what King Leopold talked about on another occasion on September the 12th, if we go back to the 1880s, when he's talking about, or he's anticipating moving into Africa and the colonization of Africa, and the idea of bringing progress into this dark continent, which was a disaster. And in many senses, the human consciousness is the new dark continent, as they describe, and they're creating stations which may be able to impair in a way that was never available to any society or despot or tyrant. So that's the danger.
For the moment, let's assume that this progress in this direction, manipulating the human genome, for example, going right into the nucleus of our cells and splicing our DNA, adding new information into our own DNA. Let's assume it's unstoppable for the moment. And the reason I say that is because the argument will be, we will cure cancer. We will end up making people more intelligent. We will eliminate genetic diseases. There's the lure of progress in those areas, and I don't think it can be denied.
Well, this lure is always there. If we go back, we will just develop this one atomic weapon, and then that will be the end of atomic weapons. We will just develop 100 atomic weapons, and that will be the end of atomic weapons. We will just develop 1,000, and that will be the end of atomic. It goes on and on and on. This intervention by science, which is driven by strategic and curiosity, strategic reasons and curiosity, always leads to a proliferation of an arms race. So yes, we're facing an arms race. They are always very good at selling the advantages of technology, and we've talked before about the pacemaker, and the pacemaker is designed to artificially help the inherent physical automaticity in the heart. So it is an example of an organic automaticity and a mechanical automaticity, and that's obviously good and important. So nobody is arguing about that, but the vast amount of resources are invested in ways to kill people, so to do away with them, to destroy them. And this goes back, we can see it going back even in Leonardo da Vinci, developing war weapons. It is the basis of a lot of technological development. Most industrial production and systems can really be traced to military systems. For example, like the Venetian arsenal, the shipbuilding and weapons base was a very important source of a lot of developments in scientific theory, and I think Galileo went there. So it's often practical people, engineers, of course, which refers back to a military origin, who develop these things. And it's the same process now. The problem is that the military-industrial complex, who is providing a lot of this wonderful networked technology, is the driving force. And what will happen as we move into a globalized world is that the attention will not so much be focused on an external enemy as focused on the citizen. And it's perpetuated by the fundamental idea of cybernetics. Cybernetics is about governance. All the studies that developed after the Second World War were often from people who had been in the war, who worked for military firms, and they were looking at governance and how they could apply technology to govern the human. Now, this technology has gone to such an extent that automaton has the capacity to, in a way, become autonomous itself, as John Lilly anticipated, and to control us. So this is why a lot of people, including Terence McKenna and that, believe that we were only a part of a great technocratic system that was coming. Marshall McLuhan talked about us being the sex organs of this being that was coming. So John Lilly, who you've talked about the solid state entity, that the converting organic material into a solid state entity, which will take over this automatic control. So unfortunately, it's not good, and there may be benefits on the way for certain groups, and they're certainly going to be sold on those benefits. But now they're openly saying that this requires that humans be altered for strategic reasons, and there's no necessity for that. And now with the recent health crisis, we have established systems whereby really on a global scale, this whatever technology can be delivered to the human body very, very quickly. And all parties support that. So unfortunately, when I look at the origin of a lot of this technology, it's not positive. The military-industrial complex is behind it, as a lot of standard academic textbooks explain.
So that our audience understands, let's be very clear about where you're coming from, which is that you see scientism and the robotization of the human being as a danger, and you are I'd have to say, a rebel against this trend. And I think you're encouraging people to rebel against this trend.
First, I'm in all these things. It's a peaceful discussion that we're talking about. I'm not against technology. I'm not against space exploration, any of that. What I'm against is a very particular type of scientific growth, which was associated with the empires of Europe, which I have defined in terms of an empire of scientism. This is the system which grew in particular in Britain, but we can also see it in Germany and a Dutch example as well, whereby imperial utilitarian interests were joined with the development of science. And science and the military-industrial complex in these imperial systems came together. And in the 1920s in particular, supported by ideas, sometimes Nietzschean ideas, sometimes communist ideas, sometimes capitalist ideas, sometimes upper-class ideas, began to coalesce around people like Bernal, and they began to understand that they could control the human body, and that this was an important goal, that we would have a caste, an elite of scientists who would control the rest of people, which they didn't have a good view of. They were either animals was one description, or machines, and therefore they were, as superior scientists, were entitled to govern us. Now that reflects a certain view which permeated the Anglo-American military-industrial complex. Churchill talked about the coming empire of the mind. So what I'm saying is this is a very, very real danger. It's a very real danger that we have to be careful about what the nature of production of these interventions in human consciousness are. And now, my starting position in all of this is that we should be spiritually evolving. We should be developing our autonomy. No man is an island, but we have to develop our inner sovereignty and our responsibility to ourselves, to other people. We have to, from there, recognize the integrity of other people, transcend our differences, and technology is a tool. But Steiner talked about this. He said from his time, that the future of humanity would always face this challenge from now on, about the merger of humans and machine. Now, this current phase, when people are unaware of the possibilities, we're unaware or don't have control over the governance system, is a very vulnerable period for the human race, which I believe the human race could be fundamentally altered in it by the desire, the overzealous desire to govern humans, to take away the predictability. Now, there'll always be good reasons. You can say it's for good governance. We'll turn bad people into good people, and that was the idea that Anthony Burgess explored in A Clockwork Orange. Now, I'm saying that that's a very, very dangerous possibility that emerges from the opportunity of technology, and that we have to be very, very careful about what we're subscribing to, in particular on a mass scale. So I'm not against the technology. I'm not afraid of technology. I'm afraid of the use of technology. And you don't have to be a genius to work out that technology has been misused, and it's used against nature, it's used against people, it's used against society. And Tolkien was one of the people that realized this. He said at the end of the Second World War that the Second World War was over, but the war continues, because he saw a great conflict between the machine and human consciousness, which is why he and C.S. Lewis sought to develop and focus on the imaginal world, the imagination, fantasy, those deep elements of the secondary imagination, which are necessary for us to understand who we are. So it's an occasion for us to really reflect on who we are in that context.
Okay, 2 points. One is, I think you meant the First World War, not the Second World War, with regard to Tolkien.
No, he was involved in the First World War, but when the Second World War was finished, his son mentioned about, so it was in relation to the Second World War, I think, that his son quoted.
The other point, now I did refer to you as a rebel, and you pointed out that didn't mean that you advocated violence. And I'd like to go back to a conversation we once had about the rebellion in Ireland. You're Irish, and I know you have a lot of emotion about Irish history and what has happened there. But I do remember you telling me at one point, because there was a lot of violence involved in resisting the British Empire, that you didn't think it was worth shedding blood and losing lives to fight the British Empire.
The reason why I didn't think that is because I think it's been ultimately a failure. And the reason why, if you look at people like Sean MacBride was an interesting character. He was a barrister. He was chief of staff of the IRA. He was an Irish minister. He later won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he won the Lenin Peace Prize as well. And he was a key driver in the development of the European Convention of Human Rights, Amnesty International, the working on international human rights. And so he was involved in violence, and he was very, very clear in that context about the limitations of the use of violence. Though, as an international lawyer, he would have supported the independence struggles, particularly in Africa, because there are legal conditions and legal rights in relation to self-determination. So my argument, in some senses, is a strategic one. That if one is making decisions like that, it has to be successful. It has to achieve its purpose, and none of them managed to ultimately protect the things that they were fighting for. The idea of an independent, cultural, homogeneous, separate identity, because there was too much focus on the political context, when really most of the forces were economic, technological. They had moved beyond, and the British knew that. I'm not talking about the context where, and in my family would have utilized. They were active in that, and they were in a military occupied context where they were fighting for the protection of their families and that. So that there are distinctions that have to be made, and I'm not saying that it's not legitimate to defend yourself. What I'm saying is that the utilization of violence, particularly as it was developed in the 60s, ultimately failed in what it was seeking to do. And it failed because take the IRA, for example. A lot of people assumed that the IRA was a Catholic organization, but there was a big Marxist influence, and the system, the automatic machine, was taken over in many senses. So this is a danger. You're dealing with all these games when people get into those games. And if people don't focus on the spiritual evolution, if they don't focus on those issues, that ultimately any achievement through weaponry, through violence, will not amount to anything. So in many senses, it's looking back on that. When I think of the people that gave their lives or sacrificed or engaged in certain rebellions, if you had asked them now whether they would have taken lives for what became in the terms in which they were fighting for it, I think a lot of them would be very unsure about that.
So with regard to the emerging new technologies, you have suggested the day may come when people will be forced to have computer chips implanted in their bodies. And I think what you're saying, it's good to anticipate that and develop a movement now, a nonviolent movement to oppose that sort of thing.
That's certainly one strategy. What I want to do personally is two things, and this is what our conversations have been about. What I absolutely share with you is our commitment to the importance of wider human consciousness, to recognition of the full extent, and to commit ourselves to spiritual evolution as the solution to all of these things. And that is the answer. Unless we evolve spiritually, all these other issues will never be solved in their own terms. So that's the first point. Secondly, the greatest threat to that is this rise in technology. So yes, what I want to do is to identify a robust analysis which is based not on conspiratorial imaginings, but on clear evidence that's available, on good evidence, where people can examine the argument that I make and test it by reference to the sources, and then test the hypothesis by comparison to the predictions that I make about what is happening. Even that I had kind of anticipated that executive order in relation to this idea of controlling the circuitry in the cell. So if my hypothesis is right, it will unfold before your eyes. And so I want to provide a robust analysis. Then the question is, and I do have discussions with people who are interested in my views around the world who do different things. Some of them establish interest in community projects to try and grow their own, become independent, grow their own food, be self-sufficient, educate people about the environment, etc., get a balance with technology. So some of them have different strategies. So there is a great interesting evolution of strategies in relation to where we are going. So in many senses, the mechanism of opposition has to be entirely different. One, it has to be non-violent. Secondly, by the nature, if I am correct, and also that we are, another important aspect of this is the thrust of cybernetics is to realize a dream which was articulated in the 19th century about creating a machine of governance. So the governance system of the new world order, the global order, is going to be automatic. That's an important point. And the old strategies are not going to work. The old ideas, even of non-violent support, are not going to work. So consistent with the idea of spiritual evolution and application of consciousness, we really have to engage on a much broader level in an imaginative way to persuade people about alternatives. So I believe that we really have to challenge ourselves to look for a different way of thinking, a really radically different way of thinking, which will be built on a identification, a robust analysis, which is not intended to be divisive or hateful, which is respectful for all people. And we can begin to look at the challenge of the autonomous phenomena of automaticity and systems of governance that's growing. So yes, the biggest issue that we have is to escape from the paradigms. And there's very interesting work by Donella Meadows, who worked with the Council of Rome and who sought to explain different levels of how a society has changed. And ultimately, the number one reason, apart from persuasion and propaganda and organization, the ultimate force, the number one force she identified, and she was important in discussions on global governance, was to re-engineer the paradigm that we operate in. So what I'm saying is that's the kind of, I know it's people don't believe in the power of paradigms, but we really have to rethink where we are. And that requires that we relinquish some of our attachments. It requires, for example, in relation to perennial philosophers, that they begin to go outside the zones in which they are automatic, to begin to seek dialogue at a higher level. So instead of saying, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Catholic, to begin to rise above that. And that's a challenge for people who have given, if you like, their whole belief system over to someone else, over to an automatic system. I'm not saying to relinquish those things, but really the challenge requires that we become unattached to some of the specificity of the paradigms that we have. And it is at that level of robust analysis which gives rise to some values which can orientate the possibilities for peaceful evolution, to combat these dangers, to anticipate these dangers, and yes, to look at the problems associated with the military-industrial complex. As some of your presidents anticipated, it did happen. The military-industrial complex is running the show, and part of it is a persuasion that ultimately the dreams that some of these people have are not going to work.
Well, you've certainly given me the impression that the approach you're arguing for is not simple-minded. It's subtle. It doesn't involve, as you say, relinquishing our attachments so much as becoming aware of them, if I'm correct. I remember back in the 1960s a similar message coming from Timothy Leary when he said, turn on, tune in, drop out. And people were dropping out of society. It was the birth of the hippie generation that I identified with, although I never really dropped out. I remained associated with colleges and universities throughout that era. But I don't think you're telling people to drop out, as tempting as that might seem.
I have a different view on Timothy Leary from most people. If you look at his SMILE policy about space exploration, increased in human intelligence, he was very much into prosthesis. He would have been, and he was, a transhumanist in my view, in any proper definition, as was Terence McKenna. If you look at what he said and about the psychedelics in the age of the intelligent mind, he's talking about changing humans with psychedelics and technology. And they were quite committed to that. I'm not. I'm against that. And unfortunately for me, if you look at Timothy Leary, he's very much associated with this context about proximity to government, despite the fact that he's in jail and all that. There is an element of his views that puts him very proximate to the orthodoxy that wants to push this. So a part of my analysis is questioning actually that milieu that you are in, Jeffrey, and the hippie movement, because it has to be revisited in many senses, and I think you get this sense from some of the talks that you have from people that were involved in it, and it comes true in their discussions, people who are at the center of that great efflorescence, that there was an element, a darker element of control and experimentation that was there as well. The possibility is there, and to what extent this was useful to the government to create a movement in the context of Vietnam War, or to experiments with psychedelics, etc. It suited an agenda, and the agenda that Huxley would have warned about. So the point that I'm making is that, and dropping out, certainly no, it's not going to work. You won't be able to drop out, because in the society of the future, everywhere is going to be scrutinized and controlled. So the dream of going out into the wood and escaping it is not going to work. And in fact, in accordance with some of the plans of the United Nations, the ability to be in certain places is not going to be available. So the dropping out is not possible. I think we have to look critically at some of the people that. It's easy when someone comes along and says, here we go, here's the drug, and this solves it all. That's all you have to do. Take this. It's too simple for me. And I know this argument is made, and I get pushback from people saying, oh, you don't understand about psychedelics. I do understand. I've read the literature. I do understand the benefits as well. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying about the danger that we give in the way that Huxley talked about. We relinquish our sovereignty for some pacified state by prosthesis, or assume that either technologically we can improve ourselves. And part of this, Jeff, is a strange misanthropy. There's a dreadful misanthropy associated with some of these movements that seem to hate the human condition as it is, that seems to be unwilling to examine ourselves as moral beings that need to look at that to do that inner work first. And associated with that misanthropy, I believe there is a kind of mechanophilia. Now I know that's a particular term, but in this widest sense, this great love of machines, and this great love of machines goes in some way together with this misanthropy. And in fact, even look at this. If you look at the figures for the growth in things like sex dolls, and good luck to them. I'm not criticizing anyone that's into that type of thing. But if you look at the 30 billion industry as the latest quantifications, for example, and the idea of literal engagement, loving machines, and the idea that this is replacing humans, there's great issues there about our relationship to machines, and there's. I heard Jordan Peterson. He did a talk recently, and I haven't heard much of him in the last few years. But he did a talk recently with a chap. It's called True Geordie in England. And before the talk, he didn't realise he was being recorded. I don't know if it made any difference, but he said that the line for him was if someone came to take his car, because the car for him. And he was quite vehement about it. The car for him was radical autonomy. And I was thinking, well, that's an interesting perspective, because for many people, the autonomy they talk about is an autonomy of a machine, of an automobile. So this is a strange idea for a person who's so interested in those issues. My argument is that we really have to explore, and this is what all the spiritual teachers say, we have to explore in a radical way our radical autonomy as individuals, and to understand the full idea of the kingdom of heaven being within us, to understand the full potential of spiritual consciousness, to understand the full possibilities of noetic inputs, of, as you have had in your life, of gifts that seem to come, or that come from the spiritual world, that alter us. These are things that no automatic system will ever be able to do. And we have to be careful that we don't, as Steiner talked, we don't give up our spirituality to the Ahrimanic force that he saw in science.
Well, I know Steiner, for example, in the Waldorf schools are very concerned about young children being engaged with computers at a very early age. They think it's contrary to the natural evolution of the human being. And in your life, You and I are communicating right now via an electronic system. So I know that you don't reject them entirely, but I do know that you choose not to own a cell phone. And so you try to find certain limits that seem appropriate to yourself in that regard.
Yeah, I don't have a cell phone. I don't drive. We don't have television. I don't need television, Jeffrey, because there's certain people will automatically repeat what's on. So if I want to hear what the discourse is, I just go and ask them, and they'll report without unconsciously. So I don't have them. Yeah, I think if you look at some of the size of television now, and you look at the way children are put in front of them, they're so dominant, so pervasive that there's a cost. This is the big thing, that people always stress the advantages, or look at the advantages, and they never stress the cost of these systems. Now, all these systems, whether television or the internet, they work on the basis of having everyone have access to them. They work on the power of network effects. But it is a net, it is a web, and once one is involved in it, then as functions are brought into the loop, we become dependent. Once you become dependent on it, it's a different ball game, and then the power shifts, and then your opportunity, you're in a vulnerable position. So this is the danger. People don't really understand the power of networks, the power of network effects, the reason why initially all this technology is fantastic, because it gives opportunity. The way Zoom, for example, came all of a sudden when there was a need for it. One has to be very, very suspicious about that. And people like Jacques Vallée, for example, that you have talked to recently and have talked to for a long time and known for a long time, some of his more interesting work for me was when he talks about the way the Soviets took over in the Baltic countries, and how strategic and specific it is to decapitate a sovereign state by taking out key individuals in it. And from his scientific and mathematical background, he understands that the simplicity of this. So I do think that there's a Supreme Court judgment in 2014. I think it was in a judgment that one of the Supreme Court judges, anyway, he may have said in a private talk, said that if a being came from outer space and he saw humans now, he would think that the mobile phone was an attachment to the human body. Now, this is a serious phase we're entering into, and children now are hooked, as Bill Gates hoped they would be. That's why he said in his book, the Road Ahead, this language of being hooked to things, being dependent. I don't like it. We're very, very dependent. And as we get more dependent on it, the power of the centralized forces, which are transnational forces, corporate forces, that are more powerful than governments, that are not beholden to anybody, that are not committed to any ethical principles, that are merely interested in their own power and the magic that Norman Wiener talked about, the gadget worship, the sorcery element. This is what the people in cybernetics warned about. So the idea, I don't think people understand the cost of looking at television. I don't think they understand how powerful a medium it is, and how addictive it is, and how powerfully it motivates other people. So I certainly am very happy with the frugality, or a technical frugal approach. There's better ways at using technology. I was always in favor of technology. That's one of the reasons why I'm concerned about it. I gave lectures with this technology on satellites before other people were doing it. I was an early adopter in some senses. So I'm aware of all those possibilities. They're always there. But we have to distinguish between use of technology and the use of or creation of networks by the military-industrial complex, which are imbued with a philosophy of surveillance and security, and which regards the citizen as a threat or a potential threat, and one that must be managed and must be managed more and more. And we can see this in China, and China wouldn't have been able to do what it did without the support of the United States and the technology from California as well.
Well, you've raised a very interesting argument. Let me suggest what might be or might not be a counterpoint. I'm thinking of evolution and how biological evolution started out with single-celled organisms, and now, after several billion years of evolution, we have human beings, and each of us, you and I, have billions of cells in our body, but these cells are not autonomous organisms anymore. They exist to support us. If they don't support us, we think that maybe it's a cancer or a disease that needs to be removed. And at the same time, I see what's happening now is we are building this infrastructure, and it's an electronic infrastructure. There are thousands of satellites now circling this planet. There are cable networks all across the planet. It's as if we are building a planetary nervous system, and we humans are literally creating a new organism. And so there's a sense in which the things that are happening could be viewed, rather than as mechanical, could be viewed as organic.
Yes, but take the example of the cables. A very important period was in the 1850s, 1860s. And in this period, we have the laying down, in particular the British imperial laying down of the submarine cables, which followed all the sea routes, which still were up to very recently, they're still very important across the Atlantic, transatlantic cables, around Africa. They followed the sea routes. So they were building this network from that time. We had the growth of the telecommunications union from the 1860s. We had the laying of the telegraphs. And this was a conscious part, but it was a conscious building of a system of imperial control. That was where it came from. It didn't come from, it'd be very interesting to facilitate a thing that Jeff will be able to talk with James in the future. It was about, or to bring people together. It was about the creation of the military industrial complex. And this is very interesting in the exhibition in the Crystal Palace in 1862. Dostoevsky comes to London, and he comes into the Crystal Palace. And the Crystal Palace is a very important symbol. We can talk about that again sometime. But he looks at all this, the great technology, and he says, he realizes that was very significant for him. He realizes that this is the future, that living inside, and he identified it as Steiner did. Steiner identifies with Ahriman. He identified it with Baal. He couldn't believe that what he saw, it really profoundly affected him. So he saw in this system some commitment to another type of worship. There was a spiritual, esoteric dimension. And you can see it with Ginsberg. He describes this industrial system as Moloch, and we can think of Mammon as well. So strangely, there is a deeper sense that there is an ancient spiritual viewpoint which is beside it. And some people trace the word mechanical back to Babylonian period, although there's a lot of discussion about that. So the argument, there is an argument that, there is certainly that argument. This is what a lot of people, even McKenna says about, we join together. And this is what Teilhard de Chardin talks about. And a lot of these people saw it in terms of a crystalline structure. And to some extent, there's a crystallization of the human mind as well. We're turning something flowing into something which is fixed and structured. And that's what they intend to do with human consciousness. So certainly, if we look at a human, we can regard ourselves as a biome, as a collection of different forces. There are many organisms. The man of war is not the jellyfish kind of figure. Is three different animals. I think principal animals come together. We recognize that, but all the spiritual traditions emphasize the uniqueness of the human. Whether you take it from a Kabbalistic perspective or a Hindu perspective or a Catholic perspective, There's this idea that we are created in the image of the divine, that we have the divine spark, that we're a fractal of the divine force, or a hologram, consistent with the discussion you had with Michael Talbot, for example, that we have in some way a reflection of the divine force within us. And the alternative view, the view of this coming together, is to a relinquishing of that autonomy to a bigger force. Now, that bigger force for Steiner is the Ahrimanic force. It is the dark force in the universe. And in Christian terms, when the devil is tempting Christ, the temptation is really the power in the material world. This is the consistent argument. This is the basis of Dr. Faustus. You can have all the power you want in this world, but we'll take your soul. That Faustian pact is there. So if you take a spiritual tradition, a spiritual approach, you're not going to relinquish this thing, because the idea is that you have a spark, a talent, that you have the possibility to grow beyond time and space in the next world, and that if you make an agreement or an acquiescence or a pact to relinquish that, to give it up to somebody else, to some other force, or to some dream of a great future and evolution, that you're relinquishing your eternal soul. So that's the spiritual objection to it. And then when you look at what these people have said about this future evolution, there are often people that don't believe in the spirit. That's why part of the transhumanist thing is this desire for immortality. Although, if you make a Faustian pact, you will want immortality, and that's a trend in these stories, that because you have given up your eternal soul, you're going to want to live longer and stay in this mundane element. So that argument is there, and people seem to be desperately desirous of this drop in the water, melting into the oceans, losing their autonomy, because they don't like it. And Dostoevsky said that people hate this responsibility, and they're willing to give it up at the drop of a hat. He didn't use those words, but that was the implication. They're willing to give it up because that's a frightening thing for them. This responsibility, this idea that you have a soul and you're responsible for it, and this gift, to look at the gift as a great objection. So all the spiritual traditions, in my view, they do suggest that if you look at Exodus, for example, and Leon Casa has written about this, although he's not coming from a religious perspective. He says that although the Israelites and Jews escaped from Egypt, they weren't escaping to a total freedom. That wasn't the idea. They're escaping to a context where they could serve the higher order. So in all these ideas about the individual is linked to the higher forces and to God by a string, or the sutrama, or the accord, there's an idea that you have freedom, but it's freedom which is limited by the golden rule, by the perennial philosophy, by having to abide by the Tao, to recognize other people, for example. So there are inherent limitations, but none of them talk in my idea about, or my interpretation, really about relinquishing your soul. You can find certain trends in Buddhism and that, but it wouldn't be the interpretation that I would take of them. And all the perennial philosophy emphasizes the significance of the sovereignty, the identity of your spiritual consciousness, and that's at the base. That's what is meant to evolve. We're not meant to give it away to somebody else who may have, and probably does have, nefarious purposes. And in that sense, we're at a point where we can decide that all that spiritual stuff was nonsense, and we can decide to relinquish our soul to the devil, if you want.
Well, I know in my conversations with Charles Upton, a religious traditionalist, he emphasizes the uniqueness of the human form. He sees that as being very important across all religions, and that we have to understand that We occupy a very special place in the universe as we are now, not as we will be in some future evolution.
It's a very strange thing, but yes, that's absolutely right. And if you look at people who were great anticipators of the problems of technology, for example, Jacques Ellul, who wrote The Technological Society, which is a seminal book anticipating the rise of technique, which would displace the human, similar to Gunther Anders and the obsolescence of man, and Bernard Charbonneau, another French critic of technology. Both of them emphasized the incarnation. Now, Jacques Ellul had come from a Marxist background, but he changed, and a kind of anarchist background. He believed that anarchism and Christianity was closer than people thought. But they both emphasize incarnation, the significance in Christian terms of the divine coming into human form. And it's similar in relation to the avatar idea in or practice, whatever you want to call it, in India. So, yes, the human body is critical, and it reflects something divine. And even if you look at some of the humanoid or the descriptions of beings which in the UFO context, etc., or some of the descriptions of other beings which may live on this earth, they do have some similarities to the human form. So there are good reasons in many ways to fix the limitation and opportunity of the human body. And there has been a failure to build on that efflorescence that happened in the Renaissance, about the humanist efflorescence, which emphasized the significance of the human body and the beauty and the measure, the idea that the human is the measure of the world. And technology has took us to a different place, where we want to measure by different speeds, where we want to measure, compare ourselves with digital force and with computers, and we pay a price for that. So there is a fundamental issue about the body, and about the idea that it's imago Dei, or reflection of the divine, and the divine spark in terms of Kabbalistic ideas, or the light within us. So even if we regard ourselves, whether from an agnostic form or other forms, as that I discussed about light, which is in this physical form, this is a physical form it's still a carrier. Now it is a particular carrier, and it's a carrier that in the traditions which was divinely inspired, whatever way it came about, whether you accept that or not. So certainly the human body as it is, now it doesn't mean that we don't we don't look after it in the best way that we can. We don't assist it if we need to restore normal expectations to it. But there is something about limitation as being the basis as well of all development. And the fact that we are separate beings, the great joy that we don't have to live in someone else's head as well as our own, that we've enough to be doing in looking after our own human mind, consciousness and body, that gives us the free will to explore in according to our means and possibilities.
Well, earlier in our conversation, James, I identified you as a rebel, but it seems to me at this point that more than being a rebel, you are a champion of the idea of individual human sovereignty.
Yes, but not in the way that Ayn Rand talked about, and not in the way that a lot of atomistic analysts. What I'm champion is the human spirit, and the human spirit, and not to the exclusion of other spiritual interpretations. For example, we really have to assess our relationship with animals as well, and our relationship with the natural world. But they are all consequences, in my view, of accepting our full spiritual nature and exploring the wider notions and wider relationships. For example, the Celtic Church's attitude towards nature, towards the divine feminine, for example, is different than what happened afterwards. So the human spirit is the essence, and spiritual consciousness, as Evelyn Underhill talked about. Now, what I would say is that if one activates, because even with automatic systems, you have to activate them. If one activates the human spirit, the human consciousness, it's only when we begin to activate and cultivate the consciousness that the possibilities, the creative possibilities, the receptivity, that's the basis of Kabbalah, opens up. So our possibilities for inspiration increase, and the full potential of spiritual evolution is available to us, so that we don't stagnate. And so from that human spirit comes the other relationships. We have to repair our relationship with nature. We have to repair the relationships to other humans, and we have to begin to reassess some of the directions that we're taking. So the spirit aspect is the key element. I don't mind being the rebel element at all. I just to clarify for people, as I've said, because sometimes when you come from an Irish background, they automatically believe that you support violence, and I've had that before. Yes, I accept in relation to the idea that we have the opening up of the spirit, that we have the exploration of the continent of the spirit and the spiritual consciousness, and the application in a sensible and disciplined way to the problems that we have, and to begin to really think in a way which anticipates solutions to the problems. And that requires really moving up to a different level of thought and exploration of paradigms, as we've said. But spirit is the basis.
Well, James Tunney, what a pleasure to be with you again, to have this conversation. It's so rich. There's so many different threads to these discussions, and you handle them beautifully. I'm delighted to be back with you once again, and look forward to many more conversations with you on New Thinking Aloud, James. Thank you so much for being with me today.
It's great talking to you again, Jeff. Can I have a final thought? Have you got time?
Yes, of course.
There was just, I read it recently, and I have read a lot, as you know, about Swedenborg, and I'm very interested in Swedenborg, as you are. And one story stuck out recently when I was looking at it. It didn't register before. This was in a secondary source. I've read a lot of what he has written. But it reminded me, it rang a bell. It's a very interesting little story. It's about his mentor, which was Christopher Polhem, and he was a great Swedish inventor, a scientist. He developed, and this is in the 17th century to the early 18th century. He developed. It was at the time of Linnaeus as well. What's believed to be the first automatic factory in the world. He developed a way of a few different inventions which worked automatically. Now, he created his automatic systems with wood. So a lot of what we would recognize now as machines and metal were done in wood first, and this is where the innovations came from. So he was a great scientist, a practical person, and Swedenborg went to, he knew him for about 3 years, and he worked as his assistant, and he also published certainly the first scientific magazine in Sweden in the early 1700s, called Daedalus Hyperboreus, and it's about Polhem. And they separated and went their own ways. Later on, as we know, that Swedenborg, who was also engaged in studies of the brain and anticipated some modern discoveries of the brain, he moved, as we know, into spirituality and left his scientific background after he had his relationships with God. And Swedenborg, for people that don't know, was believed to be able to travel into the next world, to heaven and hell. And it's quite incredible when you read what he has written about them. No other person has written as much about the afterlife that I know of. But he went to see Polhem when he was in the afterlife, which is quite remarkable. So not a seance or anything like that. he believes he's going into the other dimension. And he said that in the next world, the great mechanical mechanistic thinker was there, and he was still working on his machines, and he couldn't take the reality of the spiritual world seriously. And things got worse for him, according to Swedenborg, because then he began to try and create devices in the afterlife to communicate with the evil spirits in hell. And as a result of that, according to Swedenborg, his old friend was sent to the darker regions of the afterlife. It's quite an incredible story. And the other Swedish connection was, of course, Descartes, who we could have mentioned, who was fascinated with automata, and who his ideas of the automaton as the basis of a lot of his philosophy, and who supposedly created an automaton which reflected his daughter, who had died when she was 5. And he of course died in Stockholm. But we'll continue our conversation. Thank you very much, Jeff. It's fantastic to be continuing our conversation. Appreciate it.
It's truly a joy for me. Incredibly stimulating, and I plan to schedule more conversations with you as soon as I finish the editing of this one. James, thanks once again for being with me, and for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us.